London, 1815. They say love conquers all. I used to think that was the romantic delusion of poets and fools. I, Imogen Hartley, never imagined that accepting a duke's proposal would place me at the center of the most vicious scandal London society had witnessed in a generation. That a simple yes would transform me from an invisible craftsman's daughter into the most talked about and reviled woman in all of England. That choosing love would mean choosing public humiliation. But what I really didn't know is that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to apologize for who you are. This is the story of a woman who dared to love above her station and face the full fury of a society determined to put her back in her place, and how, against all odds, she discovered that true nobility has nothing to do with titles. But before we dive into this story that challenged the very foundations of Regency society, tell me, from what corner of the world are you watching? Leave your comment, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because this journey promises to be unforgettable. The truth is always more fascinating than fiction. There are moments in life that arrive disguised as ordinary occurrences, moments that seem so unremarkable in the passing that you fail to recognize them as the hinges upon which your entire existence will turn. For me, that moment came on a gray Tuesday morning in March, when the bells above my father's workshop door chimed to announce yet another patron, and I did not even bother to look up from the ledger I was reviewing. I should have looked up. The workshop smelled, as it always did, of wood shavings and linseed oil, of beeswax, and the particular mustiness that comes from storing fine fabrics meant for upholstery. My father's domain was a cathedral of craftsmanship, every surface covered with evidence of his artistry: half-finished chair legs, samples of exotic wood veneers, sketches of elaborate desk designs scattered across work tables. I had grown up in this space, learning to read among the sawdust, developing a peculiar education that combined classical literature with an intimate knowledge of dovetail joints and French polish techniques. I was useful here. I managed the accounts, corresponded with suppliers, and occasionally contributed design suggestions that my father was gracious enough to implement. It was a good life, I told myself, a useful life. The fact that it would never include invitations to almacs or presentations at court was simply the natural order of things. One does not mourn what one was never meant to have, or so I believed, until Maximilian Pembroke walked through that door. I heard my father's voice shift into the particular tone of deference he reserved for titled clients, warm but not familiar, respectful without being obsequious. Thomas Hartley had built his reputation on the understanding that the aristocracy appreciated quality craftsmanship, but expected appropriate social distance from those who provided it. We were artisans, not friends. We created the furniture that graced their homes, but we would never sit upon it in their company. Still absorbed in a column of figures that refused to balance properly, I registered the conversation only peripherally. A desk was wanted, something substantial, but not ostentatious. My father began his usual consultation, asking about dimensions, preferred woods, the style of the room where it would reside. I had heard such conversations 1,000 times. Then a voice, deep, educated, with an accent that spoke of Eton and Oxford, and generations of unquestioned privilege, said something that made me finally look up. He had asked my opinion. I found myself staring at a man who could only be described as inconveniently handsome, tall, with dark hair that looked perpetually on the verge of needing a trim, and gray eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. He wore his elegance carelessly, as men do when they have never had to think about whether they belong in a space. His coat was expertly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and everything about him announced wealth and position with quiet, devastating certainty. And he was looking at me as if he actually expected an answer to his question. My father's expression contained a mixture of surprise and mild alarm. We both understood the unspoken rules of these interactions. I was permitted to be present. I was, after all, essential to the business operations. But I was not meant to be noticed. I was certainly not meant to be directly addressed by a client who was, I realized with a small jolt of recognition, the Duke of Ashford. I knew of him, of course. Everyone in London knew of him. Young, unmarried, and in possession of one of the oldest dukedoms in England, he was the subject of endless speculation and maternal plotting. That he was standing in my father's workshop, asking my opinion on desk design, seemed to violate several fundamental laws of social physics. I should have demurred. I should have directed his attention back to my father. Instead, I heard myself responding with considerably more spirit than wisdom. The desk he was describing, I told him, would be entirely wrong for the purpose he had mentioned. He wanted something that projected both tradition and innovation, but the style he had selected was too firmly rooted in the former. If he truly wanted the piece to reflect both qualities, he should consider incorporating some of the newer design elements while maintaining classical proportions. I proceeded to sketch a rough design on the margin of my ledger, my mind engaged in a problem that had nothing to do with social propriety and everything to do with aesthetic truth. When I finished my impromptu lecture and looked up, I found him watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher. Amusement, certainly. Interest, perhaps. Something else that I did not yet have a name for. He told my father that I had excellent taste, and that he would like to commission exactly what I had drawn. Then he did something even more inexplicable. He asked if he might return the following week to review the preliminary designs, and whether I would be available to discuss them further. My father, to his credit, agreed with admirable composure. I, having apparently exhausted my supply of boldness, simply nodded. That should have been the end of it. A single interaction, slightly unusual perhaps, but nothing that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my existence. Dukes commissioned furniture, craftsmen created it, and the natural order of society remained undisturbed, except that he did return the following week, and the week after that. And his visits, I began to notice with growing unease, had remarkably little to do with the desk that was being constructed with meticulous care in the workshop's back room. He asked about the books stacked on the corner of my work table. He inquired about my opinions on matters that had nothing to do with furniture design. He listened when I spoke with an attention that I found both flattering and deeply suspicious. The aristocracy, in my admittedly limited experience, did not genuinely listen to people like me. They might appreciate our skills, but they did not value our thoughts. Yet here was the Duke of Ashford, returning to a craftsman's workshop with a frequency that seemed to defy rational explanation, engaging in conversations that ranged from literature to politics to the relative merits of different wood stains. My father watched these interactions with increasing bewilderment. I participated in them with a mixture of pleasure and dread, sensing that I was venturing into dangerous territory, but unable to resist the pull of genuine intellectual engagement. I told myself he was simply eccentric. The very wealthy, I reasoned, could afford to indulge peculiar whims. Perhaps he was bored with the endless sameness of society gatherings. Perhaps he found novelty in slumming among the working classes. Perhaps, and this thought I tried very hard not to entertain, he saw me as a potential diversion, a temporary amusement before he returned to his proper world and married some perfectly suitable lady with impeccable breeding. I was determined not to be anyone's diversion, so I maintained a careful distance even as our conversations grew longer and more wide-ranging. I was polite, but not effusive. I answered his questions honestly, but did not encourage intimacy. I reminded myself constantly that this, whatever it was, had an expiration date. Dukes did not form lasting attachments to craftsmen's daughters. That was simply how the world worked. The day he asked for my hand in marriage, we were alone in the workshop. My father had gone to meet with a client, and I was reviewing the final touches on the Duke's desk, which had been completed to my exacting standards. It was a beautiful piece, if I said so myself, mahogany with brass inlays, incorporating both traditional craftsmanship and innovative design elements. I was running my hand along the smooth surface, checking for any imperfection, when I heard his footsteps behind me. He began speaking, and at first I thought he was commenting on the desk. Then his words began to register, and I realized with a sensation like falling that he was proposing marriage, not asking if he might court me, not suggesting that we might explore whether we would suit. Proposing marriage. To me, Imogen Hartley, daughter of Thomas Hartley, craftsman. I laughed. It seemed the only appropriate response to what was clearly some sort of jest, albeit one in questionable taste. He did not laugh. I turned to face him fully, searching his expression for signs of mockery or madness, and found neither. What I found instead was something far more terrifying: sincerity. He was, impossible as it seemed, entirely serious. I informed him, with as much composure as I could muster, that he was clearly suffering from some temporary derangement. that he could not possibly mean what he was saying, that I was wholly unsuitable to be a duchess, that society would never accept such a match, that I had no fortune, no connections, no training in the elaborate social rituals that governed his world. He listened to my entire litany of objections with perfect patience, and then he said something that I would remember for the rest of my life. He told me that he had not asked society's permission, and he did not intend to start now, that he had met countless women who had every qualification except the one that mattered, the ability to be genuinely themselves. That in weeks of conversation, I had never once pretended to be anything other than exactly who I was, and that quality was rarer than any title. I should have refused him. Every rational consideration argued for refusal. Accepting would bring scandal, social ostracism, and a lifetime of being the woman who had reached above her station. Accepting would make me a target for every tongue in London. Accepting would mean entering a world where I would never truly belong. But something in his steady gray eyes, something in the certainty with which he spoke, made me wonder if perhaps the rules I had always accepted as immutable might be more flexible than I had imagined. If perhaps choosing love, choosing genuine connection over social appropriateness, might be worth the cost. I heard myself say yes, knowing full well that I was stepping off a cliff, and praying that the ground below was not as far away as it appeared. My father returned to find us standing together, and the Duke immediately asked for his blessing. My father, who had built his entire life on understanding and respecting social boundaries, looked at his daughter and then at the Duke of Ashford, and I watched something shift in his expression. He gave his blessing, though I could see in his eyes that he understood exactly what battles lay ahead. That evening, after the Duke had departed, my father asked me if I was certain. I told him I was certain of nothing, except that I would regret refusing more than I would regret accepting. He embraced me then, and I felt him trembling slightly, though whether from fear for me or pride in me, I could not say. The announcement of our engagement went out the following week. I spent those intervening days in a strange state of suspended animation, half expecting the Duke to come to his senses and withdraw his offer. He did not. Instead, he called upon me daily, and we spoke of everything except the storm I knew was coming, because I did know it was coming. I was not naive enough to believe that London society would simply accept this unprecedented match with equanimity. I knew that the woman who married the Duke of Ashford had expectations placed upon her, expectations that I had no training to meet. What I did not fully understand, until the announcement appeared in the papers and the first whispers reached my ears, was just how comprehensive and creative society's rejection could be. The humiliation, when it came, was exquisite in its thoroughness, and it taught me something I had not known about myself, that I possessed reserves of stubborn pride I had never needed to access before. I would need every bit of that pride in the weeks to come. The first indication that my world had irrevocably changed came not from the aristocracy, but from Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife who had always greeted me with warm familiarity when I passed her shop on my morning walks. She looked through me as if I had become transparent. I stood on the pavement, my basket hanging from my arm, confused by this sudden invisibility. Mrs. Patterson had known me since childhood. She had pressed warm buns into my hands on cold mornings and asked after my father's health with genuine interest. Yet now she bustled past me to serve another customer, her eyes sliding away from mine with practiced ease. It was only when I returned home and found my father reading the morning papers with an expression of profound unease that I began to understand. The announcement of my engagement to the Duke of Ashford had been published, and London had apparently wasted no time in forming its collective opinion. That opinion was not favorable. My father handed me the paper without comment, and I read the brief notice that declared Maximilian Pembroke, Duke of Ashford, betrothed to Miss Imogen Hartley, daughter of Mr. Thomas Hartley. It was perfectly proper, perfectly correct, and it had apparently triggered a social earthquake, whose tremors I was only beginning to feel. The Morning Post brought our first direct evidence of the scandal. 3 separate clients wrote to cancel commissions they had placed with my father. The letters were polite, of course. The aristocracy prided itself on maintaining civility even while delivering devastating blows, but their message was clear. Association with the Hartley family had become socially inconvenient. I watched my father read these letters, his face carefully neutral, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. I had known there would be consequences, but I had not fully considered that those consequences would extend to him. that my choice might damage the reputation he had spent decades building, one perfect dovetail joint at a time. He must have seen something of my thoughts in my expression, because he set the letters aside and told me firmly that no commission was worth more than his daughter's happiness, that he had not raised me to make decisions based on fear of what others might think, that if society chose to punish him for my engagement, then society had revealed itself to be less discerning than he had previously believed. His words were meant to comfort, and they did, somewhat, but they could not entirely dispel the growing realization that I had underestimated the magnitude of what I had set in motion. Maximilian called that afternoon, and I could see immediately that he too had been navigating the first waves of social reaction. There was a tightness around his mouth that had not been there before, a barely suppressed anger that made his usual easy grace seem slightly forced. He informed me with admirable directness that we had been invited to the Worthington Ball the following week. It would be our first public appearance as an engaged couple, and it would, he said carefully, likely be challenging. I appreciated that he did not attempt to minimize what lay ahead, that he treated me as someone capable of facing difficulty, rather than someone who needed to be protected from reality. I told him I would attend, naturally. What else could I do? Hiding would only confirm every criticism being whispered about my unsuitability. If I was to be the Duke of Ashford's betrothed, I would need to face society eventually. Better to do so immediately, while I still possessed some measure of courage. The week that followed was instructive in ways I had not anticipated. I learned, for instance, that social exclusion could be accomplished through 1,000 small gestures, none of them overtly rude, but all of them unmistakable in their message. The modiste, who had been perfectly happy to serve me when I came to order new work dresses, suddenly had no available appointments when I inquired about a ball gown. The stationer, who had always chatted pleasantly while wrapping my father's orders, now completed transactions in stony silence. Most painfully, I learned that even those I had considered friends could be swayed by social pressure. Miss Caroline Webb, with whom I had shared a love of reading and many pleasant afternoons discussing literature, sent a brief note expressing her regret that her mother felt it would be inappropriate for us to continue our association given the circumstances. The note was kind, even apologetic, but its meaning was clear. My friendship had become a liability she could not afford. I told myself I understood. Miss Webb was angling for a good match herself, and being associated with London's most scandalous engagement would hardly help her prospects. I told myself I did not blame her for choosing pragmatism over loyalty. I told myself many things, but they did not entirely ease the ache of discovering that affection had limits I had not previously mapped. Maximilian, to his credit, seemed to sense my growing isolation. He increased the frequency of his visits, bringing books he thought I might enjoy, and engaging me in conversations that had nothing to do with scandal or society's opinion. He was attempting, I realized, to create a shelter against the storm, to remind me that there was more to life than the judgment of people who had never bothered to know me before they decided to despise me. It was kind. It was also insufficient, because no amount of private attention could entirely compensate for the public rejection I was experiencing. No amount of his certainty could eliminate my growing doubt about whether I had made a catastrophic error in accepting his proposal. The day before the Worthington Ball, I stood in my bedroom and stared at the gown that had finally been procured. Not from the fashionable modiste who had refused me, but from a lesser-known dressmaker who was apparently willing to overlook social stigma in exchange for the premium price Maximilian had paid. It was beautiful, a pale green silk that complemented my coloring and featured delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves. It was also a costume for a role I had no idea how to play. I had never attended a society ball. My knowledge of such events came entirely from novels, which I suspected did not provide accurate guidance for navigating the complex social rituals of the ton. I did not know the dances. I did not know the unspoken rules about who could speak to whom, or how to interpret the language of fans and calling cards. I was about to walk into a room full of people who had already decided I did not belong there, armed with nothing but stubborn pride and a beautiful dress. It occurred to me, not for the first time, that I might be catastrophically out of my depth. My father must have sensed my anxiety, because he knocked softly on my door that evening and entered to find me sitting by the window, staring out at the darkening street. He sat beside me in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. He told me that he had been thinking about my mother, who had died when I was still a child, and what she might say if she were here. He He believed she would tell me that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it, that the most worthwhile things in life often required us to be braver than we believed ourselves capable of being. I asked him if he thought I was being brave or merely foolish. He considered the question seriously before responding that perhaps there was less difference between the two than we liked to imagine, that every brave act, viewed from a certain angle, could look like foolishness. The distinction lay not in the act itself, but in whether we remained true to ourselves while performing it. His words steadied something in me. I might not know how to navigate a society ball, but I knew how to be Imogen Hartley. I knew how to speak honestly and stand firmly. If that was insufficient for the ton, then perhaps the failure lay with their expectations, rather than with my character. The evening of the ball arrived with unseemly speed. Maximilian called for me in his carriage, and I appreciated that he did not offer empty reassurances about how the evening would unfold. Instead, he simply took my hand and told me that whatever happened, we would face it together, that I was not alone in this, regardless of how society might try to make me feel otherwise. The Worthington residence blazed with light. Carriages lined up outside to deposit their elegantly dressed occupants. I watched through the window as ladies in jewels and gentlemen in evening dress ascended the steps, and felt my courage waver. These were not my people. This was not my world. I was an interloper, and everyone would know it the moment I walked through those doors. Maximilian must have felt my hand tremble in his, because he leaned closer and spoke quietly. He told me that half the people in that ballroom had done nothing to earn their position, except be born to the right parents, that I had more genuine accomplishment in my smallest finger than most of them had in their entire lineages, that if anyone deserved to feel superior, it was not them. His words were meant to encourage, and they did, somewhat, but they also highlighted the fundamental problem. In society's eyes, accomplishment meant nothing compared to birth. I could be the most skilled, most educated, most worthy person in London, and it would not change the fact that I was a craftsman's daughter who had dared to accept a duke's proposal. We descended from the carriage, and I felt the weight of every eye that turned toward us. The whispers started immediately, a susurrus of shock and speculation that followed us up the steps and through the entrance. I kept my head high, and my expression serene, channeling every ounce of pride I possessed into maintaining my composure. The Worthingtons greeted us with impeccable politeness that did not quite mask their discomfort. Lady Worthington's smile was strained, and I understood that we had placed her in an awkward position. Refusing to invite the Duke of Ashford would be unthinkable, but welcoming his scandalous betrothed was clearly distasteful. Then we entered the ballroom, and I got my first full view of society assembled in judgment. The room fell silent in a way that I suspected was highly unusual for such gatherings. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Fans stopped fluttering. Every face turned toward us with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. I had known I would be the subject of attention, but I had not anticipated the physical weight of so much focused disapproval. Maximilian's hand tightened on mine, and we began to navigate the room. He introduced me to various acquaintances, and I watched as they struggled to maintain civility while making their disdain abundantly clear. The gentlemen bowed with stiff formality. The ladies curtsied with precision while allowing their eyes to communicate what their manners forbade them to say aloud. I was an aberration, an offense against the natural order, a tradesman's daughter who had somehow tricked a duke into forgetting his duty to his name and station. Then I saw her, Lady Cordelia Ashworth, surrounded by a cluster of elegant ladies who appeared to hang on her every word. She was beautiful in a way that seemed designed to intimidate, with golden hair arranged in an elaborate style, and a gown of ivory silk that probably cost more than my father earned in a year. When her gaze found mine across the room, she smiled, a cold, calculating expression that promised nothing good. She began to make her way toward us, her supporters trailing behind like a particularly vicious flock of swans. I felt Maximilian tense beside me, though his expression remained perfectly neutral. Lady Cordelia's greeting was a masterpiece of subtle insult. She welcomed Maximilian with warmth, expressed delight at seeing him, and then turned to me with an expression of polite inquiry that somehow conveyed complete dismissal. She noted that she had not seen me at any previous events, and wondered where exactly it was that we had met. The implication was clear. I did not belong in this world, and my presence required explanation. I responded with as much grace as I could muster. acknowledging that this was indeed my first society ball, and that I looked forward to experiencing many more. My words were correct, but they felt hollow even to my own ears. I was performing a role, and everyone present knew it. Lady Cordelia's smile sharpened, and she proceeded to mention, with what seemed like casual innocence, that she had known Maximilian since childhood, that their families had long expected an alliance between them, that it was such a surprise when he had chosen a different path. The message was unmistakable. I was the interloper who had disrupted carefully laid plans. I was the obstacle preventing a match that society had already sanctioned. I was, in the eyes of Lady Cordelia and her supporters, not merely unsuitable, but actively destructive. Throughout this exchange, Maximilian said very little, though I could feel his anger radiating like heat. I realized with sudden clarity that he could not truly defend me, not without making everything worse. Any attempt to champion me would only confirm that I needed championing, that I could not stand on my own merit. I would have to fight this battle myself. The evening continued in a similar vein, a series of small humiliations delivered with perfect manners. I was excluded from conversations that died the moment I approached. I was introduced to matrons who looked at me as if I were some curious specimen, rather than a fellow human being. I watched as young ladies whispered behind their fans, and then dissolved into barely suppressed laughter. By the time we left the ball, several hours later, I felt as if I had been flayed alive by 1,000 tiny cuts of propriety. My face ached from maintaining a pleasant expression. My hands trembled from being held so tightly clasped to prevent their shaking from being visible. Maximilian was silent during the carriage ride home, his jaw tight with suppressed fury. When we arrived at my father's house, he finally spoke. He actually apologized, for subjecting me to such treatment. He offered, with what I recognized as carefully controlled emotion, to release me from our engagement if I wished, to set me free from a situation that promised only continued suffering. I looked at this man who had chosen me despite every social pressure arguing against it. This man who had stood beside me through an evening of humiliation and was now offering me escape, even though I could see in his eyes that the offer cost him dearly. I told him no, that if I had wanted the easy path, I would never have accepted his proposal in the first place, that I was angry and hurt and frightened, but I was not defeated, that Lady Cordelia and her supporters would not have the satisfaction of driving me away. The relief in his expression was profound and unmistakable. He raised my hand to his lips and told me that I was far braver than I gave myself credit for, that I had conducted myself with more dignity than anyone else in that ballroom. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that dignity and courage would be sufficient to weather this storm. But as I lay in bed that night, replaying every humiliation, every whispered insult, every deliberate slight, I wondered if I had underestimated the cost of choosing love over social acceptance. The battle had only just begun, and already I felt exhausted by it. If I had harbored any illusions that the Worthington Ball represented the worst of what society could inflict, the following weeks thoroughly disabused me of that naive hope. Invitations arrived, not the warm, welcoming sort that one might wish for, but rather the obligatory kind that came because refusing to invite the Duke of Ashford would constitute an unforgivable social offense. The reluctance was palpable in the very paper upon which these invitations were written. I could practically feel the hostess's displeasure radiating from the elegant script that spelled out my name alongside Maximilian's. Each event became an exercise in endurance. I learned to recognize the various species of social cruelty, to catalog them with the same precision my father applied to identifying different wood grains. There was the cut direct, when someone simply pretended not to see me at all. There was the cold greeting, acknowledgement given with such minimal warmth that it felt more insulting than outright rejection. And then there was the false kindness, the saccharine, sweet inquiries designed to highlight my inadequacies while maintaining a veneer of civility. Lady Cordelia Ashworth proved herself a maestro of all three varieties. She had, I discovered, a remarkable talent for appearing wherever Maximilian and I happened to be. At the theater, she occupied a box directly adjacent to ours and spent the entire performance casting meaningful glances in our direction while whispering to her companions. At a musicale, she positioned herself near enough that her commentary on my dress, which she described as charming in its simplicity, was clearly audible. The phrase managed to simultaneously acknowledge my appearance while suggesting that simplicity was a euphemism for poverty and poor taste. I began to understand that she viewed my presence in Maximilian's life as a personal affront, that she had, perhaps for years, imagined herself as the future Duchess of Ashford, that my engagement represented not merely the disruption of her plans, but the theft of what she considered rightfully hers. Her supporters, and she had many, took their cues from her attitude. A certain set of young ladies, all impeccably bred and thoroughly schooled in the art of subtle warfare, made it their mission to ensure I understood my unwelcome status. They would fall silent when I approached, then resume their conversation the moment I passed, their laughter trailing behind me like a mocking echo. They would discuss fashion and acknowledge that, of course, someone of my background could not be expected to understand the finer points of style. They would mention the various accomplishments expected of a duchess: fluency in French and Italian, skill at the pianoforte, knowledge of the intricate social calendar, and express wonder at how I would possibly manage. The terrible thing was that they were not entirely wrong. I did not speak French or Italian beyond a few rudimentary phrases. I could not play the pianoforte with any degree of skill. I did not know which families were feuding with which others, or who had snubbed whom at the last assembly. My education, thorough as it was in literature and mathematics and practical business matters, had not prepared me for this particular battlefield. I tried to maintain my composure through these encounters, to remember my father's words about courage and my own determination not to be driven away. But there were moments, increasingly frequent moments, when I felt myself beginning to crack under the relentless pressure of society's disapproval. The invitation to the Blackmore ball arrived on a morning when I was already feeling particularly fragile. 3 more of my father's clients had withdrawn their commissions, citing vague concerns about timing and budget that fooled no one. I had overheard 2 shopkeepers discussing my presumption in thinking I could simply marry into the aristocracy, as if titles were goods that could be purchased rather than honors that must be earned through proper breeding. My head ached, my eyes burned from too little sleep, and I was seriously questioning every decision that had led me to this miserable point. Maximilian found me in my father's garden, where I had retreated to escape the suffocating walls of the house. He sat beside me on the stone bench without speaking, and I appreciated that he did not immediately attempt to offer comfort or solutions. He simply sat, his presence steady and solid, while I tried to gather the scattered pieces of my composure. Eventually, I told him about the lost commissions, about the whispers I could not escape, about my growing fear that I was not strong enough to withstand the sustained assault of society's rejection, about the creeping suspicion that perhaps everyone was right, that I was fundamentally unsuitable to be his duchess, and my acceptance of his proposal had been an act of monumental hubris. He listened without interruption, and when I finally fell silent, he spoke carefully. He acknowledged that he had not fully anticipated how vicious society's response would be, that he had underestimated their commitment to maintaining rigid social boundaries, that he felt responsible for placing me in this impossible position. But then he said something that cut through my self-pity more effectively than any platitude could have. He told me that if I truly wanted to withdraw from our engagement, he would not stand in my way, that he would take full responsibility for ending things, would ensure that society blamed him rather than me, that he would do whatever was necessary to spare me further suffering. The offer was genuine. I could see that in his eyes. He was not manipulating me or testing my commitment. He was offering me escape, even though the prospect of losing me clearly caused him pain. I realized, sitting in that garden with the spring sun warming my face, that I did not want escape. I wanted victory. I wanted to prove that Lady Cordelia and her supporters were wrong, that love and genuine connection could triumph over birth and breeding, that I, Imogen Hartley, daughter of a craftsman, could indeed become the Duchess of Ashford and do the role justice. I told him no, that I had not come this far, only to surrender at the first real test of my resolve, that we would attend the Blackmore ball, and I would hold my head high regardless of what insults came my way. The relief in his expression was immediate and profound. He took my hand and told me that I was stronger than anyone else he had ever known. That Lady Cordelia, for all her breeding and beauty, possessed a fraction of my courage and character. I wanted desperately to believe him. The Blackmore ball was, according to Maximilian, one of the premier events of the season. The Dowager Duchess of Blackmore was known for her exacting standards and her influence over society's elite. An invitation to her ball was a mark of social acceptance. Attendance was essentially mandatory for anyone who wished to maintain their position in the highest circles, which meant, of course, that it would be the perfect venue for my enemies to deliver their most devastating attacks. I dressed with particular care for the evening, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that Maximilian had insisted on commissioning from London's finest modiste, the same one who had previously refused to serve me. Money, it seemed, could overcome many objections, though the modiste's manner throughout the fittings had made clear that her cooperation was purely mercenary. The gown was beautiful, far more elaborate than anything I had ever worn, and I felt simultaneously elegant and fraudulent while wearing it. My father embraced me before I left, holding me perhaps a moment longer than usual. He told me that my mother would have been proud of me, that I carried myself with grace even in the face of considerable cruelty, that regardless of what happened this evening, I remained his daughter, and his pride in me was unshakable. His words fortified me somewhat, though they could not entirely dispel the dread that had been building throughout the day. The Blackmore residence was even more impressive than the Worthington estate, all imposing architecture and obvious wealth. Guests arrived in a steady stream, their jewels catching the light of countless candles, their laughter and conversation creating a sound like a hive of particularly elegant bees. I watched them from the carriage window and felt my courage begin to falter. Maximilian's hand found mine in the darkness of the carriage. He did not speak, but his grip was steady and reassuring. We had become, over these difficult weeks, true partners in adversity. Whatever awaited us in that ballroom, we would face it together. We entered to the now familiar sensation of conversation ceasing and eyes turning to track our progress. I had not grown accustomed to this reaction. I suspected one never truly did, but I had at least learned to maintain my expression of calm, despite the uncomfortable scrutiny. The Dowager Duchess received us with impeccable courtesy that bordered on warmth. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and she greeted Maximilian with obvious fondness. When introduced to me, she looked at me with frank assessment, before declaring that she hoped I was prepared for the duties that came with being a duchess. There was no malice in her words, merely a straightforward acknowledgement that my position would be challenging. I appreciated her honesty more than I could say. The ballroom was magnificent. High ceilings painted with elaborate frescoes, enormous chandeliers dripping with crystal, and what seemed like hundreds of beautifully dressed people creating an overwhelming spectacle of wealth and privilege. I felt myself shrinking inwardly, my confidence eroding with each step deeper into this glittering world, where I so clearly did not belong. Then I saw Lady Cordelia, and I understood that the evening was about to become considerably worse. She had positioned herself strategically near the center of the room, surrounded by her usual coterie of supporters. But tonight, there was something different in her bearing, a particular confidence that suggested she had been planning something special for this occasion. When her gaze met mine, her smile was triumphant and cold. She began to move toward us, and I felt Maximilian tense beside me. We both recognized that she intended to engage us publicly, in front of the maximum number of witnesses. Whatever she had planned, it would be designed for maximum impact and maximum humiliation. She greeted Maximilian with her usual warmth, then turned to me with an expression of feigned concern that set alarm bells ringing in my mind. She asked, in a voice carefully pitched to carry to nearby listeners, whether I was enjoying my introduction to society, whether I was finding it difficult to adapt to such a different world from what I was accustomed to. I responded with as much grace as I could summon, acknowledging that there was indeed much that was new to me, but that I was grateful for the opportunity to learn. Her smile sharpened, and she proceeded to express her admiration for my courage in venturing into such unfamiliar territory. She mentioned that she had been raised from birth to understand the responsibilities and expectations that came with high society, that her education had specifically prepared her for the role of duchess, that she could not imagine how overwhelming it must be for someone without such preparation to attempt to fill that position. Every word was perfectly polite. Every word was also a calculated strike designed to highlight my inadequacy. Her supporters murmured agreement, their voices creating a chorus of judgment that made my skin prickle with shame and anger. I was acutely aware that a substantial portion of the ballroom was now watching this exchange, that I was once again the center of unwanted attention. Lady Cordelia continued, her voice growing slightly louder as she addressed her immediate circle, but ensured that her words carried to the broader audience. She discussed the various requirements of a duchess, the management of multiple households, the navigation of complex social obligations, the representation of an ancient and honored title. She expressed wonder at how someone from such a vastly different background could possibly hope to meet these expectations. She suggested, with false kindness, that perhaps it would be kinder to everyone involved if certain ambitions were reconsidered before irrevocable commitments were made. The implication was crystal clear. I should withdraw from my engagement. I should acknowledge my unsuitability and remove myself from consideration. I should accept my proper place in society's hierarchy and stop embarrassing everyone with my presumptuous aspirations. The room had fallen almost completely silent. Everyone was watching to see how I would respond to this very public attack. I could feel Maximilian beside me, practically vibrating with suppressed fury, but I knew that any defense he offered would only make matters worse. This was my battle to fight. I opened my mouth to respond, though I had no idea what words would emerge. Before I could speak, however, Lady Cordelia delivered her final, devastating blow. She mentioned, with elaborate casualness, that she had heard unfortunate rumors about my father's business, that several prominent families had withdrawn their patronage, that this must be terribly distressing for my family, given that we presumably relied upon such income for our livelihood. She expressed sympathy, false, poisonous sympathy, for the difficult position this must place us in. The message beneath her words was unmistakable. My engagement to Maximilian was not only socially inappropriate, but financially motivated. I was, she suggested without quite saying explicitly, using my connection to the Duke to compensate for my family's declining fortunes. I was a social climber of the most mercenary sort, willing to endure public humiliation in exchange for the security of his wealth and position. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. My vision actually blurred for a moment, and I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to shatter. This was beyond social exclusion or subtle insult. This was a deliberate attempt to destroy what little reputation I had managed to preserve. I looked at the faces surrounding me, some curious, some satisfied, some uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. I saw the triumph in Lady Cordelia's expression. I felt Maximilian's hand grip mine with almost painful intensity, and I understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that I could not win this encounter, that nothing I said would change these people's opinions or soften their judgment, that I was surrounded by enemies who had decided long before I entered this room that I was unworthy of the position I aspired to fill. I could continue to fight, to defend myself against accusations that would never fully be disproved in society's eyes, or I could preserve what remained of my dignity by refusing to engage in a battle I could not win. I excused myself with what grace I could still summon, claiming a sudden headache that was not entirely fabricated. I saw a disappointment flash across Lady Cordelia's face. She had clearly hoped for a more dramatic breakdown, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Maximilian immediately moved to escort me out, but I stopped him with a slight pressure on his arm. If we both left, it would look like retreat, like complete defeat. I needed him to remain, to demonstrate that my departure was due to my supposed weakness, rather than any failing on his part. He understood immediately, though I could see the conflict in his expression. He wanted to leave with me, to demonstrate his solidarity, but he also recognized the strategic necessity of maintaining his presence. I left the ballroom alone, conscious of every whisper that followed me, every satisfied smile on faces that had successfully driven me away. I had been humiliated in the most public manner possible, and I had responded by fleeing. Lady Cordelia had won this battle decisively. I found refuge in a small sitting room off one of the hallways, where I finally allowed myself to collapse onto a settee and press my hands against my face. My eyes burned with unshed tears, my chest tight with suppressed sobs. I had tried so hard to be brave, to prove that I belonged in Maximilian's world, and I had failed spectacularly. Perhaps everyone had been right from the beginning. Perhaps I was simply unsuited for this role. Perhaps my acceptance of Maximilian's proposal had been a terrible mistake that had brought suffering to everyone involved. My father, Maximilian, and most of all myself. I did not know how long I sat there, lost in misery and self-recrimination. Long enough that when the door opened and Maximilian entered, I could tell from his expression that the evening had continued without improvement in my absence. He sat beside me and pulled me into his arms, and I finally allowed the tears I had been holding back to fall. He said nothing, simply held me while I cried out my frustration and humiliation and growing despair. When I finally regained some measure of control, I told him what I had been thinking. that perhaps I should withdraw from our engagement after all, that I was causing him embarrassment and damaging his position in society, that I clearly lacked whatever quality was necessary to become his duchess. His response was immediate and vehement. He told me that anyone who judged me unworthy based on my birth rather than my character had revealed themselves to be unworthy of my consideration, that Lady Cordelia's cruelty reflected poorly on her, not on me, that if society could not see my value, then society needed to reevaluate its criteria for judging worth. His words were passionate and sincere, and I wanted desperately to believe them, but belief required more strength than I currently possessed. I had been fighting this battle for weeks, enduring insult after insult, and tonight I had been thoroughly defeated in front of everyone who mattered in London society. I was not certain I had the courage to continue. Maximilian seemed to sense the depth of my despair, because he grew very quiet for a moment before speaking again. He told me that he understood if I truly wanted to end our engagement, that he would not hold me to a promise that had brought me such suffering, that his love for me, and yes, he said the word explicitly for the first time, love, meant wanting my happiness above all else, even if that happiness meant losing me. I looked up at him, startled by this declaration that came at such an unlikely moment. He looked back at me with such tenderness and sorrow that I felt something shift in my chest. He loved me, not my potential as a duchess, not my family connections or fortune, because I had neither. He loved me, Imogen Hartley, with all my inadequacies and unsuitable origins, and I realized, sitting in that quiet room while the ball continued without us, that I loved him too, that somewhere between our first conversation in my father's workshop and this moment of shared defeat, I had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Maximilian Pembroke. I told him I was not ready to give up, not yet, that I needed time to recover from tonight's humiliation, but that I was not prepared to surrender to Lady Cordelia's viciousness, that if he was willing to continue fighting, then so was I. The relief and joy in his expression made clear that this was the answer he had hoped for. He kissed me then, our first kiss, and it felt like a promise, a commitment that we would face whatever came next together, as true partners. But even as I leaned into his embrace, I could not entirely silence the voice in my mind that wondered how many more defeats we could endure before that promise became impossible to keep. The days following the Blackmore ball were among the darkest I had experienced since this entire ordeal began. I remained largely confined to my father's house, unable to face the prospect of venturing into public spaces where I might encounter the whispers and knowing looks that now followed me everywhere. My courage, which I had believed to be resilient, had revealed itself to be far more fragile than I had imagined. Maximilian called daily, his presence a mixture of comfort and guilt, inducing reminder that my suffering was the direct consequence of accepting his proposal. He brought books, engaged me in conversation, and attempted with admirable persistence to draw me out of the melancholy that had settled over me like a gray fog. I appreciated his efforts, even as I recognized their ultimate futility. No amount of private attention could compensate for public humiliation. My father watched these interactions with increasing concern. He had always been a practical man, more comfortable with tangible problems that could be solved through skill and effort than with the nebulous difficulties of social acceptance. He could create a perfect dovetail joint, but he could not repair my damaged reputation. The helplessness clearly troubled him, and I felt guilty for being the source of his distress. The invitation to the Dowager Duchess of Blackmore's garden party arrived a week after the disastrous ball, and I stared at it with something approaching horror. After my public humiliation at her previous event, I could not imagine why she would invite me to another gathering, unless, of course, the purpose was to provide society with another opportunity to witness my inadequacy. Maximilian, when I showed him the invitation, had a different interpretation. He suggested that the Dowager Duchess was known for her unconventional opinions and her tendency to support causes that other members of society found questionable, that perhaps this invitation represented something other than malicious intent. I wanted to believe him, but weeks of sustained cruelty had eroded my capacity for optimism. He convinced me to attend, however, arguing that refusing would be interpreted as definitive defeat, that Lady Cordelia would view my absence as confirmation that she had successfully driven me from society, that if I truly intended to continue with our engagement, I could not afford to hide indefinitely. His logic was sound, even if his conclusion was unwelcome. I agreed to attend, though I did so with the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to their own execution. The garden party was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and the weather conspired to be absolutely perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, ideal temperature. Nature, it seemed, had no sympathy for my preference that the event be cancelled due to inclement conditions. I dressed in a gown of soft yellow muslin that was appropriate for afternoon wear, though I lacked the elaborate accessories that other ladies would undoubtedly sport. My jewelry was limited to a simple gold chain that had belonged to my mother, and I had no parasol decorated with expensive lace or ribbons. I thought critically while examining my reflection, like exactly what I was, someone attempting to pass in a world where she did not belong. The Blackmore gardens were extensive and beautifully maintained, with carefully arranged flower beds, elegant fountains, and numerous secluded alcoves created by strategic placement of hedges and trees. Small tables had been set up throughout the space, covered with fine linens and laden with delicate refreshments. Ladies in their pastel gowns drifted through the greenery like exotic flowers themselves, while gentlemen in their afternoon attire provided darker, more solid punctuation to the scene. It was, objectively, a lovely setting. I experienced it as a gauntlet I would have to navigate while under constant hostile observation. The Dowager Duchess greeted us with the same frank directness she had displayed at the ball. She looked at me with her sharp eyes and stated that she hoped I had recovered from my previous headache. There was something in her tone that suggested she knew perfectly well that my departure had been motivated by more than physical discomfort, but she did not press the point. I thanked her for her hospitality with as much grace as I could summon, and Maximilian and I began to circulate through the party. The response was predictable: polite acknowledgments from some, barely concealed hostility from others, and a general atmosphere of uncomfortable awareness that the season's most scandalous couple had arrived. I told myself I could endure this, that I had survived worse, that Lady Cordelia's previous attacks had not destroyed me, and I would not allow this afternoon to do so either. Then I saw her, seated at a table surrounded by her usual supporters, and I realized that she had been waiting for our arrival with considerable anticipation. She wore a gown of pale pink that complemented her coloring perfectly, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have required her maid's services for at least an hour. She looked, as she always did, like the embodiment of everything a proper lady should be: beautiful, elegant, and absolutely certain of her place in the world. She beckoned us over with a smile that made my stomach clench with dread. Maximilian's hand tightened on my arm, and I could feel his reluctance to approach. But refusing her summons would create a scene, and we were already the subject of too much attention. We had no choice but to comply. Lady Cordelia greeted us with effusive warmth that was entirely at odds with the cold calculation in her eyes. She insisted that we join her table, making a great show of rearranging seating to accommodate us. The other ladies at the table, all members of her intimate circle, exchanged meaningful glances that communicated volumes about their opinion of this development. What followed was a masterclass in social torture. Lady Cordelia began innocently enough, discussing the weather and the beauty of the gardens, but gradually, with the skill of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of subtle cruelty, she steered the conversation toward topics designed to highlight my inadequacy. She discussed the responsibilities of managing a large estate, expressing sympathy for how overwhelming such duties must seem to someone unfamiliar with them. She mentioned the various social obligations that a duchess must fulfill, noting with false concern how challenging it must be to learn such things without the benefit of proper training from childhood. She spoke of the importance of family connections and alliances, wondering aloud how difficult it must be to navigate society without the support of an established network. Each comment was delivered with a smile, accompanied by expressions of concern and offers of assistance. To any casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a kind, well-meaning lady, attempting to help a struggling newcomer. Only those of us at the table understood that every word was a carefully aimed dart designed to inflict maximum damage. I attempted to respond with composure, to deflect her attacks with grace, but I was outmatched, and everyone present knew it. I was not skilled in this particular form of warfare. My education had not included instruction in how to combat insults disguised as kindness. The other ladies at the table contributed their own observations, always framed as helpful suggestions or innocent questions. They wondered whether I had secured the services of a lady's maid, experienced in styling hair for society events, noting that presentation was so important for someone in my position. They asked whether I had studied French, as conversation often switched to that language at certain gatherings, and it would be terribly embarrassing not to understand what was being said. They inquired about my knowledge of the various noble families and their relationships, expressing concern that navigating the complex web of alliances and enmities would be quite difficult without proper guidance. Every question, every comment, every solicitous observation served to underscore my inadequacy and unsuitable origins. I was being systematically taken apart in front of an audience that was growing steadily larger as other guests drifted closer to witness the spectacle. Maximilian attempted several times to redirect the conversation, but Lady Cordelia was too skilled to allow such easy escape. She would acknowledge his comments with sweet agreement, and then immediately return to her chosen topic, my unsuitability for the role I presumed to claim. The lowest point came when she began discussing my father's business, expressing what sounded like genuine concern for the difficulties he must be facing. She mentioned, with elaborate sympathy, that she had heard several prominent families had withdrawn their patronage, and she wondered how devastating this must be for someone who depended upon such commissions for his livelihood. Then she looked at me with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever, and suggested, in a voice that carried clearly to the surrounding tables, that perhaps the strain of these financial difficulties had influenced my decision to accept Maximilian's proposal, that anyone in my position would naturally be tempted by the security that such a match would provide, that there was no shame, well, perhaps a little shame, in being motivated by practical considerations rather than genuine affection. She was calling me a fortune hunter, in front of half of London society, with such careful phrasing that I could not directly refute the accusation without seeming defensive, and thus confirming the very thing I sought to deny. The surrounding conversations had ceased entirely. Everyone within hearing distance, which was a substantial portion of the garden party attendees, was now openly watching and listening. I could see satisfaction on some faces, discomfort on others, but no one intervened to defend me. No one suggested that Lady Cordelia's behavior was inappropriate, or her accusations unfounded. I was alone in a crowd of hostile witnesses, being publicly accused of the worst sort of mercenary behavior, and I had no effective means of defending myself. I felt something break inside me, some last reserve of strength that had been sustaining me through weeks of accumulated humiliation. My vision blurred with tears that I could no longer prevent from forming. My hands trembled in my lap. My carefully maintained composure shattered like glass, struck by a hammer. I stood abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair in my haste to escape. I managed to mumble some excuse, a sudden indisposition, a need for air, something equally unconvincing, and then I was walking rapidly away from the table, away from Lady Cordelia's triumphant smile, away from the whispers that erupted in my wake. I did not wait for Maximilian. I did not care about maintaining appearances or strategic considerations. I simply needed to be away from that garden and the people who populated it with their cruelty and judgment. I found myself in a secluded corner of the grounds, partially hidden by a large hedge, where I finally allowed myself to collapse onto a stone bench. The tears I had been holding back came in great gasping sobs that I could not control. My entire body shook with the force of my crying, all the accumulated grief and humiliation and rage pouring out in a torrent I was powerless to stem. I had tried so hard to be brave, to prove that I was worthy of Maximilian's regard despite my unsuitable origins, to demonstrate that character and intelligence could compensate for lack of breeding, and I had failed utterly. Lady Cordelia had systematically destroyed what little credibility I had managed to build, and she had done so in the most public manner possible. I heard footsteps approaching, and looked up to find not Maximilian, but the Dowager Duchess herself. She regarded me with an expression I could not quite interpret, then sat beside me on the bench without asking permission. We sat in silence for several moments while I attempted to regain some measure of control over my emotions. When I could finally speak without my voice breaking, I apologized for creating a disturbance at her event. Her response surprised me. She stated quite matter-of-factly that Lady Cordelia was a vicious creature who had been indulged too long by people who should have known better. That her behavior this afternoon had been unacceptable, regardless of her grievances regarding my engagement to Maximilian. That if anyone should be apologizing, it was Lady Cordelia for her appalling breach of basic civility. I stared at her, uncertain whether I had heard correctly. she continued, noting that she had known Maximilian since he was a child, and she had never seen him demonstrate such clear preference for anyone's company, that his choice of me over Lady Cordelia spoke more highly of his judgment than all of his Oxford honors combined, that Lady Cordelia possessed beauty and breeding, but lacked the character that would make her a suitable duchess. Her words were kind, but they could not entirely penetrate the despair that had settled over me. I told her with brutal honesty that I was not certain I possessed the strength to continue fighting this battle, that every appearance in society brought fresh humiliation, and I did not know how much more I could endure before I simply broke entirely. She did not offer false reassurances or empty platitudes. Instead, she acknowledged that the path I had chosen was indeed difficult, perhaps more difficult than either Maximilian or I had anticipated. But she also noted that the most worthwhile victories were never easily won, that if I truly believed my engagement to Maximilian was based on genuine affection and mutual regard, then allowing society's disapproval to destroy that connection would be a tragedy of the worst sort. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that perseverance would eventually lead to acceptance, but I had been beaten down so thoroughly, so systematically, that I struggled to envision any outcome other than continued suffering. Maximilian found us there, his face tight with barely controlled fury. He knelt before me and took my hands in his, and I could see in his expression that he had witnessed at least part of Lady Cordelia's final attack. He began to apologize for subjecting me to such treatment, for underestimating how cruel society could be, for being unable to protect me from their viciousness. I stopped him before he could continue. I told him that none of this was his fault, that Lady Cordelia's cruelty reflected her own character, not any failing on his part, that I had chosen to accept his proposal knowing that challenges lay ahead, even if I had not fully understood their magnitude. But I also told him what I had been thinking with increasing frequency over these terrible weeks, that perhaps I was simply not suited for the role of Duchess, that my unsuitability was not a matter of Lady Cordelia's opinion, but objective reality, that no amount of determination or courage could transform me into someone I fundamentally was not. The Dowager Duchess interjected then, her voice sharp with authority. She stated that suitability for any role was determined not by birth but by character, intelligence, and genuine care for those one would serve, that she had known many duchesses whose impeccable breeding had not prevented them from being terrible representatives of their titles, that she would rather see Maximilian married to a woman of real substance than to a beautiful ornament who would bring nothing but social connections to the position. Her words were forceful, but they could not entirely dispel the seeds of doubt that Lady Cordelia had so successfully planted. I was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted from the constant battle to prove my worth to people who had decided before meeting me that I had none. Maximilian asked very quietly whether I wanted to end our engagement, whether the cost had become too high, the suffering too great. He told me that he would understand if I chose to withdraw, that he would claim full responsibility for the broken engagement, would ensure that society blamed him rather than me, that he loved me too much to watch me destroyed by his world's cruelty. It was the second time he had offered me escape, and this time the temptation was nearly overwhelming. I could be free of the whispers, the deliberate slights, the constant judgment. I could return to my father's workshop and the life I had known before Maximilian entered it. I could stop fighting a battle that seemed increasingly unwinnable, but even as I considered this escape, I knew I would regret taking it. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. I would regret allowing Lady Cordelia to drive me away. I would regret surrendering without exhausting every possible means of resistance. I would regret never knowing whether persistence might eventually have led to acceptance. I told Maximilian that I needed time, that I could not make such a significant decision while still reeling from the afternoon's humiliation, that I owed both of us the consideration of reaching such a conclusion with a clear mind rather than in the immediate aftermath of defeat. He accepted this with visible relief, and I understood that he had been preparing himself for the possibility that I would choose to end things, that my hesitation represented hope, however faint. The Dowager Duchess stood, preparing to return to her other guests. Before she left, she told me that she believed I was stronger than I currently felt, that the darkest moments often came just before breakthrough, that she hoped I would choose to continue fighting, because society needed more women willing to challenge its rigid structures. Her words stayed with me as Maximilian escorted me home, my departure from the garden party having become yet another piece of gossip for society to consume. I had been publicly humiliated, had been accused of fortune hunting, and had fled in tears from Lady Cordelia's triumphant presence. By any objective measure, I had been utterly defeated. Yet as I lay in bed that night, replaying the entire terrible afternoon, I found myself growing angry rather than despairing. Angry that Lady Cordelia felt entitled to destroy me simply because I had accepted what she considered rightfully hers. Angry that society had decided I was unworthy based solely on my birth. Angry that genuine affection and mutual regard were considered less important than breeding and connections. I was tired of being humiliated, tired of accepting insults with grace and composure, tired of allowing people like Lady Cordelia to determine my worth. Something had shifted during that garden party, not toward surrender, as Lady Cordelia had surely intended, but toward a fiercer, harder resolve. If society was determined to reject me, then let them. But I would not make their victory easy. I would not simply disappear quietly to spare them discomfort. I would fight, even if fighting meant enduring more pain, because the alternative, giving up and living with regret, had become more frightening than any humiliation Lady Cordelia could devise. I did not know if my resolve would be sufficient. I did not know if love could truly triumph over the rigid social structures that governed Maximilian's world, but I knew that I needed to find out, whatever the cost. The battle was not over, and I was not yet defeated. The morning after the garden party disaster, I woke with a peculiar sensation, not the crushing despair I had expected, but rather a strange, fierce clarity. I had spent the night cycling through anger, humiliation, and grief, and somewhere in those dark hours, something fundamental had shifted within me. I was tired of being afraid. My father noticed the change immediately when I came down to breakfast. I suspect he had been prepared for tears or declarations that I could not continue, but instead, he found me dressed and composed, with an expression that he later told me reminded him of my mother when she had set her mind to something and would not be dissuaded. I informed him that I would be going to the workshop that day, that I had neglected my responsibilities there during these difficult weeks, and it was time I resumed my proper role in managing the business accounts. That regardless of what happened with my engagement, life continued, and practical matters required attention. He looked at me with a mixture of relief and concern, but he did not argue. He had always respected my need to work through problems in my own way, and he seemed to understand that returning to familiar tasks would help restore some sense of normalcy to my disrupted existence. The workshop smelled exactly as it always had, wood and wax, and the comfortable mustiness of a space dedicated to craftsmanship. I found myself breathing more easily the moment I stepped through the door, as if the familiar surroundings provided sanctuary from the hostile world beyond. Here, at least, I knew my value. Here, my contributions were recognized and appreciated rather than dismissed as presumptuous. I spent the morning reviewing accounts and correspondence, losing myself in columns of figures and lists of supplies needed. The work was soothing in its predictability, requiring concentration, but not emotional fortitude. For a few blessed hours, I could simply be Imogen Hartley, competent manager of her father's business, rather than Imogen Hartley, society's most scandalous bride-to-be. Maximilian found me there in the early afternoon, bent over the ledgers with ink staining my fingers. I looked up at his entrance, and saw immediately that he had not slept well. There were shadows under his eyes, and a tension in his shoulders that spoke of considerable distress. He had come, he said carefully, to check on me after the previous day's events, to ensure that I had not made any decisions in the heat of immediate emotion that I might later regret, to offer, once again, to release me from our engagement if I had determined that the cost was too high. I set down my pen and regarded him thoughtfully. This man who had chosen me despite every social pressure arguing against it. This man who had stood beside me through weeks of public humiliation. This man who loved me enough to offer me freedom, even though losing me would clearly cause him pain. I told him to sit down, because we needed to have an honest conversation about where we stood and what came next. He complied, though I could see wariness in his expression. He was, I realized, genuinely preparing himself for the possibility that I would end things, that yesterday's humiliation had finally broken my resolve. Instead, I began speaking about something entirely different, about the workshop and the furniture we created, about how each piece required patience and multiple stages of construction, how one could not simply wish a desk into existence, but must carefully plan each step, anticipating challenges and adapting techniques as needed, how the most beautiful pieces often emerged from the most difficult processes. He listened with visible confusion about where I was leading with this metaphor. I told him that I had spent the night thinking about Lady Cordelia and society's judgment and my own adequacy, or lack thereof, that I had cycled through anger and despair and self-pity, and that I had ultimately arrived at a realization that changed everything. I was approaching this situation entirely wrong. I had been attempting to become someone I was not, to transform myself into society's image of a proper duchess, to apologize through my behavior for the unsuitability of my origins. I had been allowing Lady Cordelia and her supporters to define the terms of engagement, to determine what qualities mattered and how success should be measured. But that approach was fundamentally flawed, because I could never win a battle fought on those terms. I would always be inadequate when judged by criteria designed to exclude me. My lack of aristocratic breeding would always be a deficiency in the eyes of those who valued breeding above all else. So perhaps, I suggested to Maximilian's increasingly interested expression, I needed to stop trying to meet their expectations. Perhaps I needed to define my own vision of what a duchess could be, one that drew on my actual strengths, rather than highlighting my weaknesses. I could not compete with Lady Cordelia on matters of breeding or social connections, but I possessed other qualities: intelligence, practical skills, genuine care for my father's workers and their families, understanding of business matters that most aristocratic ladies would never deign to learn. Perhaps those qualities, rather than being liabilities, could become assets if I had the courage to present them as such. Maximilian was staring at me with an expression I had never quite seen before, something between astonishment and admiration. He asked if I was truly suggesting what he thought I was suggesting. I confirmed that yes. I was proposing that we stop apologizing for our engagement and instead defend it aggressively. That we stop allowing Lady Cordelia to control the narrative and instead present our own version, one where our match was based on genuine compatibility and mutual regard, rather than social appropriateness. That we stop treating my background as a shameful secret and instead acknowledge it openly while highlighting the strengths it had given me. It was a radical approach, and it carried significant risks. Society might respond with even greater hostility to such defiance of their expectations, but I had reached a point where continued submission seemed more dangerous than open rebellion. I was being destroyed by inches through accumulated humiliations, and I preferred to risk destruction through bold action rather than passive acceptance of defeat. Maximilian stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the implications of what I was proposing. He noted that such an approach would require careful strategy, that we could not simply defy society without thought to consequences. But he also acknowledged that my current approach was clearly unsustainable, and something needed to change. He stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. He told me that he had been impressed by my intelligence from our first conversation, that he had admired my honesty and directness in a world where most people spoke in carefully coded phrases, that he had fallen in love with exactly who I was, not with some idealized version of who I might become with sufficient training and polish. If I was willing to fight on those terms, to present myself as valuable precisely because of rather than despite my differences, then he would support me completely. He would use his position and influence to champion this new narrative. He would make clear to society that he considered himself fortunate to have won my regard, rather than condescending to lift me from obscurity. It was, I realized with sudden clarity, exactly the conversation we should have had weeks ago. We had allowed society to define the terms of our engagement from the beginning, had accepted their framing of me as unsuitable rather than presenting an alternative vision. We had been playing defense when we should have been playing offense. I told him that I wanted to continue our engagement, but on new terms, that I would no longer attempt to transform myself into society's image of a proper duchess, that I would attend events and face Lady Cordelia's hostility, but I would do so as myself rather than as a poor imitation of what I thought I should be. The relief in his expression was profound. He crossed to where I sat and took my hands in his, and I saw in his eyes something I had not seen before, not just affection or desire, but genuine partnership. We had become, through shared adversity, true allies in a battle we both now understood we needed to fight differently. He asked if I was truly certain about this path, if I understood that it might make things worse before they got better. that society did not respond well to defiance, particularly from those it had already judged unworthy. I assured him that I understood the risks, but I also understood that the alternative, continuing as we had been, would inevitably lead to my complete breakdown, that I preferred to fail boldly while remaining true to myself, than to fail gradually while trying to become someone else. We talked for hours that afternoon, developing strategies and discussing how to implement this new approach. Maximilian suggested that we needed allies, people within society who might be sympathetic to our cause, or at least willing to consider an alternative perspective. He mentioned the Dowager Duchess of Blackmore, whose intervention at the garden party suggested she might be open to supporting us. I brought up my father, noting that his reputation and relationships with various aristocratic families could be valuable assets rather than liabilities. That perhaps instead of trying to distance ourselves from my craftsman origins, we should highlight them, present my understanding of business and practical matters as qualities that would make me a more effective duchess rather than a less suitable one. It was revolutionary thinking in a world that valued birth above accomplishment, and we both knew it would face fierce resistance. But we had tried conformity and submission, and those approaches had brought nothing but suffering. Perhaps rebellion would at least bring suffering with dignity intact. As the afternoon light began to fade, our conversation shifted from strategy to something more personal. Maximilian spoke about his loneliness within aristocratic society, how he had always felt constrained by expectations and obligations that left little room for genuine connection. How meeting me had represented liberation from those constraints, a chance to choose based on true compatibility rather than social appropriateness. I shared my own experiences of observing aristocratic society from the outside, of seeing the beauty and elegance, while also recognizing the rigid structures that limited individual choice, of believing that such a world would never include me, and making peace with that exclusion, only to have Maximilian disrupt that peace by suggesting that inclusion might be possible after all. We acknowledged, with painful honesty, that we had both underestimated the challenges we would face. That naive optimism about love conquering all had left us unprepared for the sustained assault of society's disapproval. That we had each, in our own ways, failed to provide the other with adequate support during the worst moments. But we also acknowledged that we had grown through this adversity, that shared suffering had forged a bond stronger than initial attraction could ever have created, that we understood each other now, in ways that would have been impossible without having faced these trials together. It was then that Maximilian said something I would remember for the rest of my life. He told me that he had initially been drawn to my intelligence and spirit, but that he had fallen in love with my courage, that watching me endure week after week of humiliation without losing my essential self had revealed a strength of character he had rarely encountered, that even in my moments of greatest despair, when I had questioned whether to continue, I had never once suggested that society was right to reject me, only that I might lack the endurance to withstand their rejection. His words struck something deep within me, and I found myself crying, not from despair this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and valued for who I actually was, not for who I might become with sufficient polish and training, but for the person I had always been. I told him, through tears, that I loved him, not because he was a duke, or because he offered escape from my limited circumstances, but because he had seen value in me when I had not fully seen it in myself, because he had offered me freedom even when he desperately wanted me to stay, because he treated me as an equal partner rather than a problem to be managed or a trophy to be displayed. He kissed me then, and it felt entirely different from our previous kiss after the Blackmore ball. That had been a promise made in the midst of despair. This was a commitment forged through shared understanding and genuine partnership. We sat together in the fading light of the workshop, surrounded by the evidence of my father's craftsmanship, and planned our campaign. We would not simply endure society's assault. We would mount a counter-offensive. We would find allies, control our own narrative, and refuse to accept the judgment of those who had never bothered to know me before condemning me. It was an ambitious plan, possibly an impossible one. But for the first time since our engagement had been announced, I felt something other than dread about the future. I felt hope, fierce and determined, that perhaps we could create our own path rather than following the one society had prescribed. My father joined us eventually, and we shared our new strategy with him. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then surprised us both by offering his own contribution to the campaign. He had, he revealed, been considering ways to address the situation more actively, rather than simply waiting for society to eventually accept what could not be changed. He suggested that he speak directly to several of his most influential patrons, not to plead or apologize, but to remind them of something they seemed to have forgotten, that integrity, skill, and honest dealing were not exclusive provinces of the aristocracy, that his daughter possessed qualities that would serve her well in any role she chose to undertake, that the families who were withdrawing their patronage over scandal were revealing more about their own character than about ours. It was a bold approach, and it carried the risk of alienating clients permanently, but my father, like his daughter, had reached a point where principle mattered more than pragmatism. He would not continue to accept commissions from people who treated his family with contempt, regardless of how prestigious or lucrative those commissions might be. The three of us, Maximilian, my father, and I, formed a pact that evening. We would fight this battle together, drawing on each person's strengths and supporting each other through whatever came next. We would not guarantee victory, but we would guarantee that we faced defeat, if it came, with our integrity intact. That night, after Maximilian had departed and my father had retired to bed, I sat alone in my room and reflected on how much had changed in a single day. I had begun the morning still reeling from the garden party humiliation, uncertain whether I possessed the strength to continue. I was ending it with a concrete plan, genuine hope, and a profound sense of partnership with both Maximilian and my father. Lady Cordelia had attempted to break me at that garden party. She had deployed her most devastating weapons with the clear intention of driving me away from Maximilian and back to my proper place in society's hierarchy. She had failed, not because her attacks were ineffective. They had been devastatingly effective, but because they had ultimately produced an outcome opposite to her intention. Rather than convincing me to surrender, she had provoked me to fight more fiercely than ever before. I did not know if our new strategy would succeed. I did not know if society could be persuaded to accept an unconventional duchess, or if we were simply delaying inevitable defeat. But I knew that I would rather fail while being authentically myself than succeed through endless compromise and self-abnegation. The alliance between Maximilian and me had become something deeper through shared adversity. It had become love, not the romantic fantasy of novels, but the real, tested, hard-won love that emerges when two people face difficulty together and choose each other repeatedly despite the cost. Whatever came next, we would face it as partners, as equals, as two people who had looked at society's rigid structures and decided that those structures were less important than genuine connection. It was revolutionary thinking. It was dangerous thinking. It was also, I believed with fierce certainty, right thinking. The battle was about to enter a new phase, and this time I would not be fighting alone, or fighting to meet someone else's expectations. I would be fighting for the right to define myself on my own terms, to create a marriage based on mutual regard rather than social appropriateness, to prove that love and compatibility mattered more than birth and breeding. Lady Cordelia had won many battles, but the war was far from over, and I had just discovered that I possessed reserves of strength and determination I had not known existed until they were required. The garden party had been my lowest point, but from that nadir, I had found the clarity and courage to begin climbing upward. The transformation in our approach became evident almost immediately, though not in ways I had anticipated. Maximilian began by requesting a private meeting with the Dowager Duchess of Blackmore, whose intervention at the garden party had suggested sympathies that might be cultivated into active support. He returned from that meeting with cautious optimism and news that she had agreed to host a small dinner party where we might be introduced to several individuals she believed would be receptive to our situation. These were, she had explained, people who had themselves chafed against society's more rigid conventions, or who had sufficient confidence in their own positions to risk association with scandal. It was a beginning, at least, a crack in the wall of unified opposition we had been facing. My father, meanwhile, set about implementing his own strategy with characteristic thoroughness. He began by making a list of his most prestigious clients, those whose patronage carried significant social weight, and divided them into categories based on his assessment of their character and likely receptivity to his message. I watched him work with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He was risking the reputation he had spent decades building, and he was doing so for my sake. The weight of that sacrifice pressed heavily on me, even as I tried to honor his choice by not questioning or attempting to dissuade him. His first visit was to the Earl of Pemberton, a client of 20 years standing who had commissioned numerous pieces and had always treated my father with respect that bordered on genuine friendship. The Earl was known for his somewhat unconventional views and his tendency to value merit over birth, qualities that made him a logical first target for my father's campaign. My father returned from that meeting looking thoughtful, rather than defeated, which I took as an encouraging sign. The Earl had listened, he reported, with genuine interest to my father's defense of my character and capabilities. He had expressed concern about the damage that rigid social structures inflicted on individual happiness, and he had agreed, somewhat tentatively, to attend the Dowager Duchess's dinner party and form his own impression of me without the filter of Lady Cordelia's narrative. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental after weeks of unbroken defeats. Over the following days, my father made similar visits to other clients, carefully selecting those he believed might be persuaded to reconsider their positions. Not all of these meetings went as well as the first. Several patrons made clear that they had no interest in involving themselves in scandal, regardless of the principles at stake. But enough responded with cautious openness that we began to perceive the outline of a potential support network. What struck me most forcefully during this period was how my father's intervention shifted something fundamental in the dynamics we had been navigating. Until now, the battle had been primarily between me and Lady Cordelia, with Maximilian caught in the middle, attempting to defend me while managing his own social position. But my father's direct involvement reframed the conflict in important ways. He was not a member of aristocratic society, which meant he was not bound by their unspoken rules about what could and could not be said directly. He could speak truths that Maximilian's position made awkward for him to articulate. He could defend my worth in terms that emphasized competence and character, rather than attempting to minimize the significance of my unsuitable origins. Most importantly, his willingness to risk his own reputation demonstrated that this was not merely a social scandal, but a matter of genuine principle, that real people with real achievements and real dignity were being judged unworthy, based solely on accidents of birth. The dinner party at the Dowager Duchess's residence was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and I approached it with complicated emotions. This would be our first attempt to implement our new strategy, to present ourselves on our own terms, rather than constantly defending against Lady Cordelia's attacks. The stakes felt enormously high. I dressed with particular care, choosing a gown of deep burgundy that Maximilian had commissioned, elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but not attempting to mimic the elaborate styles favored by ladies like Lady Cordelia. I wanted to look appropriate for the occasion while remaining authentically myself. My father embraced me before I left, and I saw in his eyes both pride and worry. He was not invited to this dinner. It was strictly an event for society's elite, but his influence had helped make it possible. I promised him that I would represent our family with honesty and dignity, that I would not pretend to be something I was not merely to win approval. The Dowager Duchess's residence was more intimate than the grand ballrooms where I had previously encountered society's judgment, and I found the smaller scale somewhat less intimidating. The dinner party comprised only 12 guests, carefully selected individuals who the Dowager Duchess believed might be sympathetic to our situation. Maximilian and I arrived together, and I noticed immediately that the atmosphere was different from previous events. There was still curiosity and assessment in the gazes that turned toward us, but less of the open hostility I had grown accustomed to navigating. These people, at least, were willing to suspend judgment long enough to form their own impressions. The Earl of Pemberton greeted me with unexpected warmth, noting that my father had spoken very highly of my capabilities, and that he looked forward to forming his own acquaintance with me. His wife, a sharp-eyed woman who I later learned was known for her intelligence and independent thinking, studied me with frank interest. The other guests included a baronet, who had made his fortune in trade before inheriting his title, a viscount known for his support of educational reforms, and several ladies who had reputations for unconventional thinking. The Dowager Duchess had assembled, I realized, a carefully curated group of individuals who were predisposed to value merit over mere breeding. Dinner was served in an elegant dining room, and I found myself seated between the Earl of Pemberton and the baronet. As the meal progressed and conversation flowed, I made a conscious decision to implement the strategy Maximilian and I had discussed. Rather than attempting to minimize my background or apologize for my lack of aristocratic training, I spoke honestly about my experiences managing my father's business, my education in practical matters, and my observations about society from my unique vantage point. The Earl asked about the furniture-making process, and I found myself describing the intricacies of joinery and wood selection with genuine enthusiasm. The baronet, who had his own history of being dismissed by society's elite before his inheritance elevated his status, asked pointed questions about how I planned to handle the responsibilities of being a duchess. I answered honestly. I acknowledged that I lacked training in many traditional aristocratic accomplishments, but I emphasized that I possessed other skills that might prove equally valuable: understanding of accounting and estate management, direct knowledge of how businesses operated, genuine relationships with working families, who would likely be tenants on any estate Maximilian managed. I was not attempting to argue that my background made me superior, merely that it did not make me inherently inferior, that different experiences could provide different but equally valid forms of preparation for the role I would need to fill. The conversation grew more animated as the evening progressed. The Viscount's wife, Lady Catherine, proved to be particularly engaged, sharing her own experiences of being judged unsuitable when she had married due to her family's intellectual pursuits being considered inappropriate for a lady. She expressed frustration with society's tendency to value conformity over genuine capability, and her support felt like validation of everything I had been thinking. At one point, the Dowager Duchess herself intervened in the conversation to note that the aristocracy had, throughout history, been strengthened by periodic infusions of new blood and new perspectives, that families who clung too rigidly to notions of purity often found themselves weakened by insularity, that Maximilian's choice of me might represent exactly the sort of revitalization that his family line needed. Her words were carefully chosen, and I understood that she was not merely expressing personal opinion, but actively shaping a narrative that others in attendance might adopt and spread. She was lending her considerable social weight to the argument that my background could be reframed as an asset rather than a liability. The evening concluded with several of the guests expressing genuine interest in continuing our acquaintance. Lady Catherine invited me to join her for tea later in the week. The Earl of Pemberton mentioned that he would be hosting a small gathering and hoped we would attend. The baronet told Maximilian directly that he believed society's rejection of our match said more about society's limitations than about our unsuitability. As we departed, the Dowager Duchess took me aside briefly. She told me that I had conducted myself admirably, that my honesty and refusal to dissemble had impressed her guests, but she also warned me that this was merely a beginning, that Lady Cordelia and her supporters would not simply accept this alternative narrative without mounting a counteroffensive of their own. I assured her that I understood, and that I was prepared to continue fighting for as long as necessary. The carriage ride home was quiet, both Maximilian and I processing the evening's events. Finally, he spoke, his voice containing an emotion I could not quite identify. He told me that watching me speak so confidently about my background and experiences had made him fall in love with me all over again, that I had been magnificent in my refusal to apologize or minimize who I was. I felt tears prick my eyes, but these were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time since our engagement had been announced, I had spent an evening in society without feeling diminished or inadequate. I had been myself, fully, authentically myself, and I had been met with respect rather than contempt. It was not universal acceptance. It was not even acceptance from a majority of society, but it was proof that a different path might be possible, that we were not facing a completely unified opposition, that cracks existed in the wall that we might exploit if we had sufficient courage and persistence. The following days brought evidence that our strategy was beginning to have effects, though not all of them positive. Word of the dinner party spread, as word inevitably does in society's interconnected circles. Some responded with curiosity, expressing interest in meeting me themselves, rather than relying solely on Lady Cordelia's characterization. Others responded with increased hostility, viewing our refusal to accept society's judgment as arrogant defiance that merited even harsher punishment. Lady Cordelia herself apparently responded with fury. According to reports that reached us through various channels, she was outraged that we had found allies willing to support our position. She redoubled her efforts to isolate us socially, making clear to her extensive network that anyone who showed me kindness would risk her considerable displeasure. But the critical difference was that her efforts were no longer completely effective. The Dowager Duchess's support provided cover for others to express sympathy without risking total social ostracism. The Earl of Pemberton's willingness to defend me in conversations gave permission for others to question whether unanimous rejection was truly justified. My father continued his own campaign, speaking to clients and acquaintances with quiet persistence. He He did not argue or plead. He simply reminded people of truths they had temporarily forgotten in the excitement of scandal. That character mattered. That integrity could not be inherited. That judging someone solely by their birth revealed more about the judge than the judged. Some of his conversations bore fruit. One client, a marquis known for his fair-mindedness, actually sent a note apologizing for having withdrawn his commission and requesting that the work resume. He acknowledged that he had reacted to social pressure, without considering whether that pressure was justified, and he regretted his hasty judgment. That single letter, more than anything else that had happened, gave me hope that change might truly be possible. If one person could reconsider and apologize, perhaps others might follow. The tea with Lady Catherine proved to be another breakthrough. She introduced me to several other ladies who shared her frustration with society's rigid conventions, and I found myself welcomed into a circle of women who valued intelligence and independent thinking over blind adherence to tradition. They were not powerful enough to override Lady Cordelia's influence entirely, but they provided social cover and genuine friendship that made society events far less isolating. Maximilian, for his part, became more openly defiant in his support of me. Where previously he had attempted to navigate social situations with diplomatic care, he now made clear through both words and actions that attacks on me would be met with his direct opposition. When a gentleman at his club made a disparaging comment about our engagement within his hearing, Maximilian responded with such cold fury that the man apologized immediately. Word of such incidents spread, and gradually the nature of society's response began to shift. It was no longer universally assumed that I would eventually withdraw from the engagement or that Maximilian would come to his senses and realize his error. Instead, people began to recognize that we were committed to each other and to fighting for acceptance on our own terms. This recognition did not translate to approval. Many still viewed our match as inappropriate and maintained their social distance. But it did create space for a more nuanced response. Those who had been sitting on the fence, uncertain whether to risk association with scandal, began to inch toward cautiously positive positions. 3 weeks after the Dowager Duchess's dinner party, Maximilian came to me with a proposal that represented the culmination of everything we had been working toward. He suggested that we host our own event, a ball at Ashford House that would serve as a formal declaration of our commitment and a direct challenge to those who sought to prevent our marriage. It was an audacious plan, one that carried significant risks. If we hosted a ball and no one attended, the humiliation would be devastating and possibly fatal to any remaining hope of social acceptance. But if we could convince a sufficient number of people to attend, it would represent a decisive shift in the balance of power. We spent days planning the event, carefully considering every detail. The guest list was particularly crucial. We needed to invite enough people that the event would not appear sparsely attended, but we also needed to focus on those most likely to actually accept the invitation. We drew on the relationships we had built over the previous weeks, targeting individuals who had expressed support, or even cautious sympathy for our position. My father contributed to the planning, offering insights about various aristocratic families based on his years of working with them. His practical knowledge of who truly valued quality and integrity versus who merely performed those values for social approval proved invaluable. The Dowager Duchess, when we informed her of our plans, expressed both approval and caution. She agreed to attend herself and to use her influence to encourage others to do likewise. But she also warned us that Lady Cordelia would almost certainly use the event as an opportunity for some final, devastating attack, that we should be prepared for her to attempt to sabotage the evening in whatever way would cause maximum damage. We acknowledged the risk, but decided to proceed regardless. We had been fighting defensively for too long, allowing Lady Cordelia to choose the battlefield and dictate the terms of engagement. It was time to seize initiative and force society to make a clear choice, to either accept our union or reject it definitively, but to stop maintaining the current state of prolonged uncertainty and sustained hostility. The invitations went out, elegant cards that announced a ball at Ashford House in honor of our engagement. I watched them depart with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, knowing that we had committed ourselves to a course of action that would either vindicate our strategy or confirm our complete failure. The responses, when they began arriving, were mixed but more positive than I had dared hope. Many declined, offering various excuses that barely concealed their unwillingness to be associated with our scandal. But a significant number accepted, enough that the event would not be embarrassingly sparse, though not so many that we could declare complete victory. Most tellingly, Lady Cordelia accepted the invitation. Her response was perfectly proper, expressing delight at the opportunity to celebrate our engagement. But I could read the threat beneath the polite phrases. She would attend, and she would use the occasion to launch whatever attack she had been planning. I told Maximilian of her acceptance, and we looked at each other with grim understanding. The ball at Ashford House would be the decisive battle in our campaign. Whatever happened that evening would likely determine whether our marriage could proceed or whether we would finally be forced to admit defeat. We had 3 weeks to prepare, and we intended to use every moment to ensure that when Lady Cordelia made her move, we would be ready to counter it. The war was reaching its climax, and we were about to discover whether our strategy of defiant authenticity could triumph over society's entrenched prejudices. The morning of the ball dawned with unseasonably perfect weather, clear skies and mild temperature that seemed almost mocking in their cheerfulness. I had not slept well, my mind cycling through every possible disaster that might unfold during the evening. Lady Cordelia's acceptance of our invitation hung over me like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread, and I knew that she would not attend merely to offer her congratulations. Ashford House had been transformed over the previous days into a space that reflected both Maximilian's heritage and my own influence. The ballroom featured several pieces that my father had created specifically for the occasion, not ostentatious displays of wealth, but rather elegant furniture that demonstrated the intersection of traditional craftsmanship and innovative design. It was a deliberate statement, a visual representation of how different worlds could complement rather than contradict each other. My father had insisted on personally overseeing the installation of these pieces, and I had watched with profound gratitude as he ensured that every detail met his exacting standards. He would not be attending the ball itself. Such an event was far outside the bounds of what society would tolerate, but his presence was woven throughout the space, in ways that those with eyes to see would recognize. I spent the afternoon in a state of controlled anxiety, alternating between certainty that we had made the right decision and terror that we were about to experience our most spectacular failure yet. Maximilian found me in the library, where I had retreated to escape the preparations happening throughout the house, and he sat beside me without speaking for several moments. Finally, he asked if I was having second thoughts, if I wanted to cancel the event and pursue some less confrontational approach. His tone made clear that he would support whatever decision I made, even at this impossibly late stage. I told him no, that we had come too far to retreat now, that Lady Cordelia would interpret cancellation as definitive victory, and I refused to give her that satisfaction, that regardless of what happened this evening, I wanted to face it rather than hide from it. He took my hand and told me that he was proud of me, that my courage over these difficult months had exceeded anything he had any right to expect, that whatever transpired tonight, he considered himself fortunate to have me as his partner. His words steadied me somewhat, though they could not entirely dispel the dread that had settled in my stomach like a stone. As evening approached, I dressed with meticulous care in a gown that had been created specifically for this occasion. It was magnificent. Deep emerald silk that brought out the color of my eyes, with delicate embroidery that incorporated subtle references to both Maximilian's family crest and my father's craft. The modiste had outdone herself, creating something that was both entirely appropriate for a duchess and unmistakably influenced by my own aesthetic sensibilities. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized, not because I had transformed into someone else, but because I was seeing myself as I might be, not apologetic or diminished, but confident and worthy. The woman in the mirror looked like she belonged in this elegant gown, in this grand house, in the role of duchess. I desperately hoped that confidence was not merely self-delusion. Maximilian was waiting for me at the top of the grand staircase, and the expression on his face when he saw me made something flutter in my chest. He looked at me as if I were the only person in the entire world who mattered, and for a moment, my anxiety receded in the face of his obvious love and admiration. He offered me his arm, and together we descended to take our positions in receiving our guests. The first arrivals were the most reliable of our supporters, the Dowager Duchess, the Earl of Pemberton and his wife, Lady Catherine and her husband. They greeted us with warmth that went beyond mere politeness, and their presence helped establish the tone for the evening. If society's most respected members were willing to celebrate our engagement, it became easier for others to follow their lead. Gradually, the ballroom began to fill. Not to capacity, There were notable absences that communicated volumes about who remained firmly opposed to our union, but to a respectable level that suggested we had not been completely ostracized. I recognized faces from previous events, people who had previously maintained careful distance, but who now appeared willing to extend cautious acceptance. The atmosphere was different from other society events I had attended. There was still curiosity and assessment, but less of the overt hostility that had characterized my earlier experiences. People were watching to see how I would conduct myself as hostess, whether I would prove capable of managing such an event with appropriate grace and competence. I was determined not to disappoint them. I moved through the ballroom with Maximilian, greeting guests and ensuring that everyone felt welcomed. I drew on everything I had learned from observing society events: the proper phrases, the appropriate gestures, the subtle signals that communicated respect and appreciation. But I also infused these interactions with genuine warmth, rather than merely performing the expected rituals. Lady Catherine found me during a brief moment when I was not actively engaged with guests. She told me, with a conspiratorial smile, that I was doing magnificently, and that several people had commented favorably on my poise and hospitality, that the evening was proceeding far better than many had anticipated. Her words gave me a burst of confidence that lasted approximately 10 minutes, until Lady Cordelia made her entrance. She had clearly dressed with the intention of making an impression, wearing a gown of pale gold that made her look like some sort of ethereal goddess. Her entrance commanded attention in the way that only someone supremely confident of their social position could manage. She moved through the ballroom with her usual coterie of supporters trailing behind her, and I watched as conversations paused and eyes tracked her progress. She approached Maximilian and me with a smile that made my skin prickle with apprehension. Her greeting was perfectly proper. Her congratulations on our engagement delivered with apparent sincerity, but I could see calculation in her eyes, and I knew that she was merely positioning herself for whatever attack she had planned. Maximilian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on mine, and I understood that he too sensed danger in her seemingly benign presence. The evening continued, and I began to relax slightly as no immediate disaster materialized. Guests danced, conversed, and partook of the elaborate refreshments that had been prepared. The ball was, by any objective measure, a success, well attended, smoothly executed, and generating the sort of positive conversation we had desperately needed. I should have known that Lady Cordelia was simply waiting for the optimal moment to strike. That moment came during a brief lull in the dancing, when a substantial portion of the ballroom's occupants were standing in conversational groups rather than actively engaged in activity. Lady Cordelia positioned herself near the center of the room, surrounded by her supporters, but speaking loudly enough that her words carried to a wide audience. She began by expressing admiration for Ashford House and the elegance of the evening's arrangements. She complimented the furniture, noting with what seemed like innocent curiosity that several pieces appeared to be of exceptionally fine craftsmanship. She wondered aloud whether they might be the work of the renowned Mr. Hartley, whose creations graced so many of London's finest homes. I felt ice form in my stomach. She was building toward something, and I could not yet see the shape of her attack, but I knew it was coming. She continued, discussing the importance of quality craftsmanship and how certain families had built their reputations on such skills. How admirable it was when people understood their proper roles and excelled within those roles. How the social order functioned best when everyone accepted their position and contributed according to their natural station. The words were innocuous on their surface, but the implication was devastatingly clear. She was reminding everyone present that I came from craftsman stock, that my proper role was to appreciate fine furniture from a distance, rather than to imagine myself qualified to be its social equal. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing an attack, even if they could not yet determine its precise nature. Maximilian moved closer to me, his body language protective, but I knew that any defense he offered would only make matters worse. Lady Cordelia paused, as if struck by a sudden thought, and then addressed me directly. She asked with elaborate innocence whether my father would be creating furniture for Ashford House once we were married, whether I intended to maintain my involvement in his business affairs, whether I planned to continue managing accounts and corresponding with suppliers even after assuming the role of Duchess. The questions were delivered as if they were merely curious inquiries, but their purpose was transparent. She was highlighting the fundamental incompatibility between my background and my aspirations. She was reminding everyone that I was not born to this role and suggesting that I would inevitably bring inappropriate elements of my previous life into a position that required complete dedication to aristocratic responsibilities. The ballroom had fallen almost completely silent. Everyone was watching to see how I would respond to this very public challenge. I could feel their assessment, their judgment, their curiosity about whether I would crumble under this attack or somehow manage to defend myself effectively. For a moment, a long, terrible moment, I felt myself beginning to panic. This was Lady Cordelia's masterstroke, delivered at our own ball in front of everyone whose opinion mattered. She had waited until I felt secure, until I had relaxed into the role of hostess, and then she had struck with precision, designed to expose my fundamental unsuitability. Then I felt Maximilian's hand on my back, a subtle gesture of support that no one else would notice, but that communicated everything I needed to know. He was with me. He believed in me. He trusted me to handle this in whatever way I chose. And I remembered the conversation we had had weeks ago, after the garden party disaster. The decision we had made to stop apologizing for who I was and instead defend my worth on my own terms. I looked directly at Lady Cordelia, and instead of shrinking from her attack, I met it head-on. I thanked her for her interest in my father's business and confirmed that yes, several of the pieces in Ashford House were indeed his work. I noted with pride that his craftsmanship was sought after by the most discerning families in London, precisely because he brought such skill and integrity to everything he created. I then addressed her underlying question directly. I acknowledged that yes, I did intend to maintain involvement in my father's business to whatever extent my responsibilities as Duchess permitted, because I believed that understanding practical matters, how businesses operated, how accounts were managed, how quality was assessed, would make me more rather than less effective in managing estates and households. The ballroom remained silent, but the quality of that silence had shifted. People were listening now, not with the anticipation of watching me fail, but with genuine curiosity about where I was leading. I continued, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. I noted that the role of Duchess, as I understood it, involved considerable responsibility for estate management, tenant welfare, and household administration, that these responsibilities required exactly the sort of practical knowledge I had acquired through my involvement in my father's business, that perhaps the traditional aristocratic education, for all its emphasis on accomplishments like music and languages, sometimes neglected to develop skills that were directly relevant to actual duties. I was not arguing that my background made me superior, but I was clearly and definitively arguing that it did not make me inferior. That different preparation could be equally valid, if one focused on substance rather than merely form. Lady Cordelia's expression had shifted from triumphant confidence to something approaching alarm. She had expected me to stumble or become defensive. Instead, I had taken her attack and transformed it into an opportunity to articulate exactly the argument Maximilian and I had been developing over the past weeks. Before she could respond, the Dowager Duchess intervened in the conversation with devastating effect. She noted, in a voice that carried clearly throughout the ballroom, that she had known many duchesses over her long life, that some had been impeccably trained in all the traditional accomplishments, and had nonetheless proven utterly incompetent at actually managing their responsibilities, that she would rather see a duchy in the hands of someone with practical skills and genuine intelligence than someone who could merely perform elegance without substance. Her words constituted an unambiguous endorsement of my position, delivered by someone whose social authority was beyond question. Other voices began to join in, the Earl of Pemberton expressing agreement, Lady Catherine noting that society had long undervalued practical knowledge, the baronet observing that many of the most successful estate managers brought business acumen to their roles. The conversation that had begun as Lady Cordelia's attack on my suitability had transformed into a broader discussion about what qualifications truly mattered for aristocratic responsibilities, and that discussion was trending in directions that supported rather than undermined my position. Lady Cordelia attempted to regain control of the narrative, suggesting that surely no one was arguing that proper breeding was irrelevant, that centuries of tradition existed for good reason, that some standards must be maintained if society was to function effectively. But her words sounded hollow now, defensive rather than authoritative. She had lost control of the conversation, and more critically, she had lost the unified support she had previously enjoyed. People were questioning, considering alternative perspectives, and recognizing that perhaps unanimous rejection of my suitability was not as justified as they had assumed. Maximilian chose this moment to speak, and his words represented the culmination of everything we had been working toward. He stated clearly and publicly that he had chosen me not despite my background, but in part because of it, that he valued intelligence, capability, and genuine character over mere breeding, that he believed the Ashford Duchy would be strengthened rather than weakened by having a duchess who brought new perspectives and practical skills to the role. He then did something that I had not anticipated, but that proved devastatingly effective. He knelt before me, a duke, kneeling before a craftsman's daughter, and asked if I would do him the honor of becoming his wife, officially and formally, in front of all these witnesses. It was theater, of course. We were already engaged, but the symbolism was unmistakable. He was demonstrating through action that he did not consider himself superior to me, that he viewed our union as one between equals, that he was choosing me deliberately, publicly, and without reservation. The ballroom was utterly silent. Every person present understood that they were witnessing a moment of profound significance, not merely a proposal, but a challenge to fundamental assumptions about birth and worth and social hierarchy. I looked down at Maximilian, kneeling before me with love and certainty in his eyes, and I understood that my response would resonate far beyond this single moment, that what I said and how I said it would become part of our story, the narrative that people would tell about the craftsman's daughter who became a duchess. I told him yes, but I also helped him to his feet, making clear through gesture that I did not require him to kneel, that I valued partnership over hierarchy, mutual respect over deference. The applause that followed was not universal. Several guests remained conspicuously silent, Lady Cordelia among them, but it was substantial and genuine. People were moved by what they had witnessed, whether they fully approved or simply recognized the undeniable sincerity of the moment. Lady Cordelia attempted one final gambit, suggesting with acid sweetness that it was fortunate the evening had concluded so romantically, as it would provide everyone with pleasant memories to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The threat in her words was clear. She was not conceding defeat, merely acknowledging that this particular battle had not gone as she had planned. She would continue her opposition, would find other opportunities to undermine our position. But something fundamental had shifted during this evening. She no longer commanded unanimous support for her position. People had seen me defend myself effectively, had watched Maximilian publicly declare his commitment, and had been forced to consider whether their automatic rejection of our union was truly justified. The ball continued for several more hours, and I moved through it in a state of exhausted exhilaration. Guests approached to offer congratulations that seemed increasingly genuine rather than merely perfunctory. Conversations happened that suggested people were beginning to accept that our marriage would indeed take place, and that perhaps it was time to make peace with that reality. When the last guests had finally departed, and Maximilian and I stood alone in the now quiet ballroom, I felt something release in my chest that I had not realized I had been holding tense. We had survived. More than survived. We had achieved something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Maximilian pulled me into his arms and told me that I had been magnificent, that watching me stand up to Lady Cordelia and articulate our position with such clarity and confidence had been one of the proudest moments of his life. I told him that I could not have done it without him, without his unwavering support, without his willingness to publicly demonstrate his commitment, without his belief in me when I struggled to believe in myself. We stood together in that ballroom, surrounded by my father's furniture and the evidence of our successful challenge to society's rigid conventions, and I understood that we had accomplished something important, not merely securing acceptance for our own marriage, but demonstrating that alternative paths were possible, that birth did not have to determine destiny, that genuine connection could matter more than social appropriateness. The following days brought clear evidence that the evening had indeed shifted public opinion. Invitations began arriving, not from everyone, but from enough people that I would no longer face complete social isolation. Clients who had withdrawn their patronage from my father began tentatively reaching out to resume business relationships. The whispers that followed me were more likely to be curious than contemptuous. Lady Cordelia, according to reports that reached us, had withdrawn to her family's country estate. Whether this represented permanent retreat or merely strategic regrouping remained to be seen, but her absence from London social events was conspicuous and telling. The Dowager Duchess called upon me privately to express her satisfaction with how the evening had unfolded. She noted that I had shown exactly the sort of courage and intelligence that the role of Duchess required, that she believed I would bring credit to the position, rather than diminishing it. My father, when I visited him at the workshop to share news of the ball's success, embraced me with tears in his eyes. He told me that my mother would have been so proud of the woman I had become, that I had honored our family not by pretending to be something I was not, but by refusing to accept that who I was made me unworthy. His words meant more to me than any social acceptance could ever achieve. The wedding was set for 6 weeks hence, and the preparations proceeded with considerably less opposition than we had faced during our engagement. Not everyone approved. There remained pockets of resistance. Families who would never fully accept a craftsman's daughter as Duchess, regardless of how effectively I defended my position. But the unified wall of hostility had cracked, and through those cracks, acceptance had begun to seep. Maximilian and I spent those weeks planning not just our wedding, but our future together. We discussed how we would manage the Ashford estates, drawing on both his traditional knowledge and my practical business experience. We talked about the changes we hoped to implement, the ways we might challenge other rigid social conventions. We dreamed about creating a marriage that was truly a partnership between equals, rather than a hierarchy based on birth and gender. Lady Catherine hosted a small gathering for me to meet with other ladies who shared her unconventional views, and I found myself welcomed into a circle of genuine friendship. These women had their own stories of challenging social expectations, and they offered both support and practical advice about navigating the complexities of aristocratic life while maintaining one's integrity. The wedding day arrived with the same perfect weather that had graced our ball. The ceremony was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, and while the attendance was not as large as some society weddings, it was substantial enough to demonstrate that we had achieved genuine acceptance from a significant portion of London's elite. My father walked me down the aisle, and I could see in his bearing both pride and the poignant awareness that he was giving his daughter to a world far removed from the one in which he lived. But he placed my hand in Maximilian's with confidence, trusting that the man who had chosen me saw value that transcended social boundaries. The vows we spoke were traditional, but they felt revolutionary in context. I was promising to be Maximilian's wife, not as some sort of social climber who had lucked into an elevated position, but as a partner who brought genuine value to the union. He was promising to be my husband not as a duke, condescending to lift someone from obscurity, but as a man who had found exactly the companion he wanted for his life's journey. When we emerged from the church as husband and wife, I looked out at the crowd that had gathered, some friendly, some merely curious, some still disapproving but unable to prevent what had now been formally solemnized. I saw my father standing with tears streaming down his face. I saw the Dowager Duchess smiling with satisfaction. I saw Lady Catherine and the other friends I had made applauding with genuine enthusiasm. And I understood, with profound clarity, that I had accomplished something I had not fully believed possible when I first accepted Maximilian's proposal. I had not transformed myself into society's image of an acceptable duchess. Instead, I had transformed society's understanding of what a duchess could be. I, Imogen Hartley, no, Imogen Pembroke, Duchess of Ashford, had proven that love and genuine partnership could transcend the rigid boundaries of birth and breeding. That courage and authenticity could win battles that conventional warfare could never achieve. That sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to apologize for who you were. The journey had been far more difficult than I had imagined. The humiliations had been real and devastating. The moments of despair had nearly broken me, but standing there with Maximilian's hand in mine, looking out at a world that had been forced to reconsider its assumptions, I understood that every challenge had been worth enduring. Lady Cordelia had attempted to humiliate me at what should have been a celebration of my engagement. She had deployed every weapon in her considerable arsenal to drive me away from Maximilian and back to my proper place in society's hierarchy. She had failed. Not because her attacks were ineffective, but because they had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened my resolve. Not because I had proven her characterization of me wrong, but because I had convinced enough people that her characterization was based on flawed criteria. The Duke had knelt and asked for my hand despite the scandal, despite the opposition, despite every social pressure arguing against our union. And I had accepted, knowing full well the battles that lay ahead, because I believed that genuine connection mattered more than social convenience. We had both been right to take that risk. The cost had been high, but the reward, a marriage based on true partnership and mutual respect, was worth every moment of suffering. As we rode away from the church toward our future together, Maximilian asked me if I had any regrets, if I wished we had chosen an easier path. I told him the truth, that I regretted the pain we had both endured, the humiliations and the attacks, but that I did not regret choosing him, that I would make the same decision again, even knowing everything we would face, because what we had built together through shared adversity was stronger than anything that could have been constructed through easy acceptance. He kissed me then, and it felt like a promise, a commitment that we would continue to face challenges together as true partners, building a life that honored both tradition and innovation, both heritage and possibility. I had been humiliated at what should have been my engagement celebration, but that humiliation had sparked a transformation in me, in Maximilian, in our understanding of what our marriage could be. The Duke had knelt and asked for my hand instead of allowing society to drive us apart. And together, we had proven that sometimes love truly could conquer all, not effortlessly, not without cost, but ultimately and definitively. I was Imogen Pembroke, Duchess of Ashford, daughter of a craftsman, wife of a duke, living proof that the boundaries society drew between acceptable and unacceptable, worthy and unworthy, were far more permeable than anyone had believed possible. And I intended to spend the rest of my life continuing to prove that character mattered more than breeding, that genuine partnership transcended social hierarchy, and that the most worthwhile victories were always the ones that required courage to achieve. The war was over. We had won, and the life we would build together, starting from this moment, would be our ultimate triumph.